The first time I heard my sister call me a kidnapper, I was standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. 15 years earlier, she had walked away from her 5-year-old daughter during the worst medical crisis of that child's life, and I had been the one who stayed. I thought that chapter was buried. Then Celia grew up, strangers began learning her name, and my sister suddenly went on television with a completely different version of our past. What I couldn't understand was why she needed that lie now, or what would happen once Celia started asking questions neither of us wanted to answer. If you're listening with me today, I hope you're doing well. Stay with me to the end, because the truth behind my sister's accusation began long before she ever said the word kidnapping. And if stories like this mean something to you, I'd be happy to have you subscribe and stay with us. To understand how my sister could look into a television camera 15 years later and call me a kidnapper, you have to go back to the spring of 2011. That was when the most frightening thing in our family was not a lie. It was a number on a hospital monitor that kept moving in the wrong direction. Celia was 5. She had inherited none of the softness people like to imagine sick children possess. Even then, she was stubborn, suspicious of nurses carrying medicine cups, and deeply offended by anyone who tried to hide bad news behind a cheerful voice. Her kidneys had been failing because of a congenital disease we had known about for years. Knowing something may happen and watching it happen are two different kinds of knowledge. By that spring, appointments had become admissions. Admissions had become weeks organized around lab results, dialysis, medication schedules, and conversations spoken quietly outside her room. Her father had died when she was 2. After that, Meredith had been her only surviving parent with legal authority. For a long time, nobody questioned what that meant. She was Celia's mother. The hospital called her first. Forms waited for her signature. Nurses looked toward her when decisions had to be made. But by the time Celia's kidneys reached end-stage failure, Meredith had begun disappearing in smaller ways before she disappeared in the large one. She started arriving later in the mornings, then leaving before dinner. There were days when she sat beside Celia's bed staring at her phone. Our mother, Elaine, brushed Celia's hair because it had tangled against the pillow. My father, Richard, learned where the vending machines were on 3 different floors. I learned which nurses liked their coffee black, because I was there often enough to notice. Meredith learned the quickest route to the parking garage. I tried not to judge her at first. I was 24 and unmarried. I was still young enough to believe exhaustion was something sleep could fix. Meredith was 27 and had already buried the father of her child. Now she was watching that child become thinner under hospital blankets. There were days she looked as if her body had forgotten how to rest, even while sitting still. I told myself people survived terror differently. Then the donor discussions became real. The transplant team had been evaluating options. Because I was healthy and willing to be tested, I entered the living donor process. That did not mean I walked into the hospital one afternoon and offered a kidney like a spare set of keys. There were blood tests, scans, appointments. There were questions about my health, my finances, my reasons. Members of the donor team spoke to me without Meredith or my parents in the room. They made sure I understood that being related to Celia did not obligate me to give her anything. I could stop. I could change my mind. I could say no without the doctors telling my family why. That freedom scared me more than pressure would have. Every time someone reminded me I could walk away, I had to ask myself whether I wanted to. I did not feel brave. I pictured surgical complications. I pictured losing work. I pictured waking up with part of my body missing and discovering that love did not make recovery easier. Once, sitting alone in my car outside the hospital, I rested my forehead against the steering wheel. I watched a group of women about my age cross the parking lot, laughing over something one of them had said. They wore office clothes and carried shopping bags. For a few ugly seconds, I wanted their lives so badly that I resented them for having them. Then I went upstairs. Celia was asleep when I reached her room. Meredith was not there. The breaking point came after another long week. Celia's treatment plan grew more complicated while Meredith became less dependable. She missed a meeting with the medical team and arrived hours later looking freshly showered, wearing clothes that had not spent the day collecting hospital air. I followed her into an empty family consultation room before she could leave again. I do not remember every word I said. I remember keeping my voice low because Celia was down the hall. I remember the cheap vinyl chair pressing against the back of my legs. I remember Meredith standing with one hand wrapped around the strap of her purse, already angled toward the door. I asked her how long she planned to keep treating the hospital like a place she could visit when she had the strength for it. Something in her face changed, not dramatically. She simply stopped pretending I had misunderstood her absences. She spoke about being 27, about having already lost years to grief, about the possibility that Celia might not survive even if everyone did everything right. She did not shout. That would have been easier to hate. Her voice was tired and flat. The voice of someone trying to make a terrible decision sound like arithmetic. Then she said the sentence I would hear again in my head for years. I won't ruin my future for a child who may not make it. There are sentences that hurt because they are cruel. That one hurt because Celia was close enough that I could picture her small hand resting on the hospital blanket while her mother said it. I did not slap Meredith. I did not give her a speech about motherhood. I just stared at her until she looked away. The hospital could not operate on outrage. Celia still needed care, and Meredith's intention to leave created a practical problem immediately. A social worker sat down with us and reduced our family disaster to the questions that actually mattered. Who could consent? Who could coordinate care? Who could make daily decisions if Meredith was not going to remain available? That conversation forced Meredith to do something concrete before she left Chicago. She signed a short-term guardianship and caregiving instrument, giving me authority to care for Celia while treatment continued. I watched her sign her name. I watched the pen pause once, and then move again. There was no secret exchange in a dark hallway. Nobody forged anything. Nobody smuggled Celia out of the hospital. Her mother signed. And then her mother left. For years afterward, people sometimes praised me for what happened next, as though I had transformed at that moment into someone nobler than I had been the day before. I never knew how to answer them. The truth was far less elegant. I was terrified. The day after Meredith left, I still had to remember which medication Celia had taken. I still had to answer calls. I still had to sit through my donor appointments, knowing the person who should have been sharing the weight had chosen not to. My parents helped, but they were frightened too. My father became angrier every time Meredith's name appeared on a form. My mother responded by cleaning things that were already clean. I kept moving because stopping would have required deciding what else to do. The donor evaluation continued. Nobody rushed it because Meredith had gone. I had more testing, more discussions, more opportunities to withdraw. Celia had to be stable enough for the transplant to proceed. The doctors had to be satisfied that we were doing something medically sound, not emotionally desperate. Weeks passed. When the surgery was finally scheduled, I remember lying awake the night before, running 2 fingers along my side and wondering what it would feel like afterward. Celia had asked earlier whether the doctors would know which kidney to take. I had told her they were professionals and not picking organs from a vending machine. She accepted that with the grave suspicion of a 5-year-old who had already discovered adults were not as competent as advertised. The transplant succeeded. That sentence barely begins to cover the experience. There were bright lights, pain, nausea, and alarms that turned out to be routine. For hours I was too drugged and sore to care whether anyone thought I was brave. Celia did well, but she was still a little girl recovering from major surgery. I was an adult recovering from major surgery. Love did not cancel either fact. My parents became the bridge between us. Mom handled meals, medication reminders, and the endless small things nobody photographs when they tell a story about sacrifice. Dad drove wherever someone needed to go and complained about Chicago traffic as though personally offended by every red light. I spent the early weeks learning how slowly a person could stand up and still call it standing. Meredith did not come back. Eventually, the temporary arrangement could no longer be treated as temporary. With Celia living under my care and Meredith not resuming her day-to-day responsibilities, I petitioned for long-term guardianship. Meredith received notice. She did not appear to take Celia home. She did not object and present a plan to resume parenting. The court process was not cinematic. There was paperwork, review, waiting, and professionals concerned with stability rather than family speeches. When it was done, I became Celia's court-appointed guardian. That did not make me her mother. It made me the adult who had to make sure she had clean socks on Monday morning. Those years taught me how much of raising a child is ordinary work, mostly socks and forms. Once I had medical clearance to work normally again, I returned to the public library. I gradually assembled 3 sources of income, because one steady paycheck did not cover everything our household had become. I kept my library hours, picked up some evening shifts elsewhere, and worked a weekend gig when I could. Insurance and assistance covered what they covered. Real life remained full of rent, groceries, transportation, medication copays, missed hours, and the thousands of ordinary expenses that never arrive with dramatic music. For about 2 years, time became something I spent before I had it. One evening, I fell asleep on the bus and woke 3 stops past mine with my cheek pressed against a cold window. Another time I stood in the grocery aisle doing mental subtraction with $23 left until payday. Celia studied cereal boxes as if selecting a retirement portfolio. I hated how tired I was. Sometimes I hated that my friends could cancel plans because they were tired while I canceled mine, because someone had a lab appointment. I watched people my age take weekend trips, move cities, date carelessly, make mistakes that only belonged to them. There were nights after Celia fell asleep when I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by unopened mail, and wanted one whole day in which nobody needed anything from me. Then morning came, and apparently I was still responsible for breakfast. My most memorable failure involved lunch. I had slept maybe 4 hours, packed Celia's lunch before sunrise, and sent her off feeling unusually pleased that I had remembered everything. That afternoon she opened the lunchbox on our kitchen counter and removed a yogurt, 2 spoons, a packet of ketchup, and nothing else. She stared at the collection, then at me. Is this lunch or a scavenger hunt? I laughed so hard I had to sit down. It was not a beautiful laugh. It came out half exhausted and half horrified. Celia started laughing because I was laughing, and soon the 2 of us were leaning over a kitchen counter beside the saddest lunch in Illinois. Those were the moments that actually made us a family, not documents, not courtrooms, not even the kidney. The fact that we kept showing up for the next ordinary thing. Piano entered our lives almost by accident. During recovery, Celia had fewer physical outlets than other children her age. Her body had already dictated too much of her childhood, so I looked for things she could approach without someone constantly telling her to slow down. A community music program had an old upright piano, its finish worn smooth at the edges by generations of nervous hands. Celia sat in front of it and immediately became serious. At first, the sound was not impressive. For a stretch of time, one particular middle C appeared so often in our house that I began to suspect it was following me. Celia would play a few notes, stop, begin again, and return to that same stubborn key. One afternoon, she caught me closing my eyes after what must have been the 20th repetition. I thought, with a kind of rueful affection, that giving away a kidney had not finished me, but middle C might. Celia saw my face. She raised one finger and struck the exact note again. Then she grinned. That was the beginning. Not of fame, not of destiny, just of something she liked that belonged to her. Over time, the exercises became pieces, the pieces became lessons, and the lessons became something more serious. Scholarships and community conservatory support helped as her ability outgrew what I could have afforded. Mentors opened doors I did not know existed. Later came competitions and regional orchestra appearances. Eventually, performance fees made her music less of a household expense and more the start of a profession. But before all that, piano was simply the place where Celia could press a key and know exactly what sound her own hand had caused. 15 years passed, in the way years usually do, less like a montage and more like a stack of Tuesdays. By October of 2026, I was 39 and still working at a public library in the Chicago suburbs. I had met Paul in 2012, after Celia and I were through the worst of the medical recovery, and we married the following year. He taught high school science and possessed the kind of dry patience that made teenagers trust him and telemarketers regret calling. Our daughter, Mara, was 13. She and Celia had grown up less like cousins than sisters, separated by 7 years, with very different ways of filling a room. Celia could fill a room without trying. Mara learned early how to occupy the edges of one. I did not notice that difference as clearly then as I would later. At 13, Mara was easy to praise. She remembered assignments, found rides when schedules became complicated, and rarely demanded an immediate answer. If I asked whether she needed anything, she usually said she was fine. And because there was always something happening around Celia, a rehearsal, an interview, a scheduling problem, a performance, I became too willing to believe her. Celia, meanwhile, was 20 and standing on the edge of a larger career. She was not a household name. Nobody was stopping her in airports every 10 feet. But people in the classical music world knew her, regional orchestras booked her, and national attention had begun arriving in careful increments. That autumn, journalist Ruth Kaplan was preparing a long profile on her. Celia told me afterward that Ruth had been interested in the years before the concert halls. Not just awards or teachers, but what music had meant when Celia was little. So, Celia told her the truth she knew. She said she had suffered kidney failure at 5. She said her aunt had donated a kidney. She said I had raised her afterward. She did not say it as an accusation against Meredith. She barely spoke about Meredith at all. That was why what happened next felt so strange. The teaser for Ruth's profile appeared online on a gray October morning. There was a photograph of Celia at a piano, not looking at the camera, and a short passage about the childhood transplant and the aunt who had become her guardian. I read it at our kitchen table before work. I finished my coffee and thought mostly about whether Ruth had made Celia sound too solemn. The following morning, Paul was already dressed for school when he came into the kitchen holding his phone. He did not tell me something was wrong. He set the phone beside my coffee mug. A television clip was paused on the screen. For a second, I did not recognize the woman sitting beneath the studio lights. Meredith had changed in 15 years the way all of us had. Her hair was shorter. The softness around her face had sharpened. She wore the calm expression of someone accustomed to being listened to. Then Paul pressed play. I heard my sister describe herself as a young mother who had been overwhelmed during her daughter's medical crisis. She said her family had taken control. She said she had been pushed aside while she was vulnerable. Parts of it were close enough to truth to make my skin tighten. Then the interviewer asked what she believed had actually happened to her daughter. Meredith looked directly toward the camera. She said I had taken Celia from the hospital. She said I had kept her child away from her. Then she gave the story its new name. My sister kidnapped my daughter. A graphic appeared beneath her face. Kidnapped. I did not hear what came next. The refrigerator hummed behind me. Somewhere upstairs, Mara dropped something and called to Paul that she was fine before either of us had asked. My hand was still wrapped around my coffee mug, but I could no longer feel its warmth. 15 years of alarms, school mornings, bus rides, piano scales, bills, birthdays, and waiting rooms had been reduced to a single word: kidnapping. My sister had taken the life I had spent 15 years building with Celia and turned it into a crime in front of millions of people. For several seconds after Meredith said the word kidnapped, nothing in my kitchen seemed willing to move. Paul's phone kept playing. The host leaned forward with the practiced concern television people use when they know a story has just become larger than the segment they planned. A photograph of Celia at 5 appeared beside one from one of her recent performances. Beneath both images ran the same word in capital letters: kidnapped. I reached over and stopped the video. The kitchen became quiet again, but not ordinary quiet. The refrigerator motor clicked off. Rain tapped against the window over the sink. Upstairs, Mara was moving through her morning routine, opening drawers and closing closet doors. She was unaware that the woman I had not seen in years had just accused me of a crime before most people in Chicago had finished breakfast. Paul slid the phone away from my coffee. My first instinct was strangely practical. I looked at the clock and thought I would be late for work. Then my own phone began vibrating. The first call came from the library. My supervisor had seen the clip shared online and wanted to know whether I needed the day off. She did not sound accusatory. That almost made it worse. I could hear the careful distance in her voice, the kind people use when they have no idea whether they are speaking to a victim of a public lie or someone whose family secret has finally surfaced. I told her I would not be coming in. By the time I ended that call, 2 messages had appeared from people I had not spoken to in months. One contained nothing except a link to the segment and the words, "Is this your sister?" Another asked whether there was more to the story. Of course there was more to the story. There were 15 years more. But 15 years do not fit inside a text box. Paul's phone started ringing too. He looked at mine, then his, then the tablet on the counter, where another notification had appeared. Apparently we own too many devices. It was the driest thing he could have said, and under any other circumstances I might have smiled. Instead, I turned all 3 screens face down. By 9 o'clock, Celia's management team had contacted her. The television segment was being clipped, reposted, shortened, captioned, and stripped of context, faster than anyone could answer it. Interview requests were already arriving because Ruth Kaplan's profile teaser had given the story an easy frame. Gifted young pianist survives kidney failure, aunt becomes donor and guardian, biological mother reappears, and says the child was stolen. A story that had taken 15 years to live had taken less than 15 minutes to package. Celia came downstairs wearing sweatpants and one of Paul's old college shirts, her hair twisted into a knot at the back of her head. She had been awake late, rehearsing the night before. She had expected coffee and a quiet practice session this morning. Instead, Paul handed her his phone. I watched her face while the clip played. She did not cry. She did not swear. Her expression became more still with every sentence Meredith spoke. The resemblance between the 5-year-old girl who used to refuse bad-tasting medicine and the 20-year-old woman in my kitchen became almost painful. When Meredith said, "My sister kidnapped my daughter," Celia pressed pause herself. Her thumb stayed on the screen. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then she opened the teaser from Ruth's article and reread the passage that mentioned my kidney donation and guardianship. She began scrolling through the messages from her manager. Her breathing changed first. It became shallow and controlled, the way it did before she walked onto a stage. She wanted to answer. Not vaguely, not politely. She wanted the transplant history made public. She wanted the guardianship records. She wanted people told exactly who had spent nights beside her hospital bed and who had left. Her manager had already warned her that anything she released would be copied everywhere. Anger had given Celia the dangerous clarity of believing that truth and strategy were the same thing. I understood the impulse because I had it too. There were documents that showed I had not stolen her. There were dates. There were court proceedings. There had been professionals involved at every stage. The simplest response would have been to photograph everything we could find, put it online, and let strangers decide which woman looked more convincing. But the person at the center of those records was standing 3 feet from me. Celia's childhood was not my evidence locker. I told her we would answer facts carefully, with legal advice if necessary. We were not going to turn her transplant, medical history, and childhood into ammunition for a social media war. Her jaw tightened. She wanted to know why Meredith was allowed to tell a story publicly, while we had to sit quietly and be reasonable. That question had no satisfying answer. I told her I was not asking her to protect Meredith. I was asking her not to hand millions of strangers parts of herself we could never take back. She looked toward the dark screen of Paul's phone. She already did. That sentence ended the discussion more effectively than an argument could have. Celia went upstairs without slamming anything. That was worse. The house had always been noisy when she was truly angry. Piano lids closed too hard. Cabinet doors suffered. At 20, she had learned how to remove herself instead. Paul waited until we heard her bedroom door close. Then he carried our untouched coffee to the sink. For the next hour, we dealt with what could be dealt with. A lawyer recommended by someone Paul knew agreed to speak with us later that day. My supervisor told me the library would direct media calls away from staff. Celia's management issued no statement. They only confirmed she would keep her scheduled professional commitments. Nothing exploded. That was what surprised me most. Public disaster did not feel like a bomb. It felt like water entering a house through 10 small cracks at once. A number I did not recognize called 3 times. I stopped answering unknown numbers. Somebody left a message at the library asking whether the kidnapping aunt still worked there. Paul found it before I did. He deleted it from the forwarded voicemail after saving what might matter later. I hated that we were already learning to separate insult from evidence. Near noon, Mara came into the kitchen looking for something to eat. She knew enough by then to understand that Aunt Meredith had said something terrible online. We did not sit her down and replay the segment. She was 13. She did not need every adult failure delivered to her in real time. She opened the refrigerator and saw the 3 of us still scattered around the house on a weekday. She quietly made herself a sandwich. I almost told her to let me do it. Then my phone buzzed again. By the time I looked back, she had already gone upstairs with her plate. Paul noticed too. Neither of us said anything. Not yet. The lawyer call that afternoon was brief and practical. I described the television accusation. He explained that a public claim like kidnapping could have civil implications. The immediate advice was simple. Preserve what was being said. Do not retaliate emotionally. Do not contact Meredith in anger. And do not dump private records online. It was exactly what I had already told Celia. Hearing a lawyer say it did not make me feel wiser. It made me feel tired. After the call, I stood at the kitchen counter, sorting mail that had accumulated over the week. I was not reading it. I was arranging envelopes into increasingly neat piles. Paper was easier to control than my sister. Paul sat across from me. He had been unusually quiet since morning. I assumed he was worried about work, Mara, Celia's schedule, or some combination of all 3. Instead, he asked the one question I had not prepared for. Did you tell Celia everything? My hand stopped on an electricity bill. For a second, I thought he meant the guardianship, the hospital, Meredith leaving. I reminded him that I had never lied to Celia about where she came from. I had never told her Meredith died. I had never invented a prettier explanation for why her mother was absent. Paul did not challenge any of that. He only waited. There are people who win arguments by speaking louder. Paul had always been more dangerous when he did not. I looked down at the envelope in my hand. The paper had bent under my thumb. I said again that I had never lied. Paul's face changed just enough that I knew I had answered a different question than the one he asked. Not lying was not the same as telling everything. There was one part. One afternoon, I had stored so far behind everything that came afterward. I almost never let myself touch it. 19 months after the transplant, Meredith had come back. I had never told Celia. The memory did not arrive dramatically. It came with the image of my parents' front porch. In late 2012, brown leaves trapped against the steps, and a familiar car parked crookedly at the curb. Celia and I were spending the afternoon at my parents' house. By then, I was back on my feet physically, though my life still felt assembled from temporary arrangements that had somehow become permanent. The court had appointed me Celia's guardian. Her routines had settled. Medical follow-ups still structured our calendar, but hospital fear no longer occupied every room. She had also begun asking questions about Meredith. Not constantly. That would have been easier. She asked in bursts. Was Mom still in Chicago? Did Mom know the transplant worked? Would Mom come to her birthday? Had Mom left because Celia was sick? Children can ask the questions adults spend years avoiding in 6 words while eating cereal. We had tried to answer without poisoning her against someone she still loved. Then, one afternoon, Meredith appeared at my parents' house without warning. I was in the kitchen when Dad saw her through the front window. His whole body changed. For 19 months he had carried his anger like a sealed container. Seeing Meredith broke the lid. Mom moved faster than he did and stopped him from opening the door immediately. I remember the two of them whispering harshly in the entryway, while Celia sat in the next room with a workbook open on her lap. I went outside. Meredith looked healthier than the woman who had left the hospital. That was the first thing I noticed, and I hated myself for noticing it. Her hair was longer. Her coat looked new. She had put weight back on. She looked like someone whose life had continued. Mine had too, of course. It had simply continued in a different direction. She said she wanted to see Celia, not discuss guardianship, not talk about medical responsibility. See her. The request was so small that refusing it outright would have made us look cruel even to ourselves. But the months after Meredith left had taught us what her presence could cost Celia. She had struggled with anxiety around separation and medical settings. There had been counseling. We had worked hard to build routines predictable enough that she no longer watched every doorway, expecting someone to disappear through it. Our family had already discussed what should happen if Meredith ever returned. The guidance we had received was not that she could never see Celia again. It was that any re-entry needed to be consistent, gradual, and centered on the child rather than the adult's guilt. My father did not care about gradual. He wanted Meredith gone. He stepped outside while we were talking and told her that if she intended to walk back into Celia's life only to disappear again, he would fight her every step of the way. Dad did not have the legal authority to erase Meredith from the world, and I knew it. But anger rarely chooses its vocabulary carefully. Mom persuaded him to go back inside. Then Meredith and I walked to the end of the driveway, where Celia could not see us through the front window. I explained the obvious things, without pretending they were easy. Celia was stable. She had routines. If Meredith wanted contact, it could not begin with a surprise appearance followed by another long absence. There would need to be consistency, counseling, a schedule. A willingness to show up not only when emotion demanded it, but when life became boring. Meredith listened. At first, then the practical questions came. She was rebuilding her life. She did not know where she would be living in 6 months. She might leave Illinois. She could not promise weekly visits. She was not prepared to take responsibility for medical appointments again. She said she only wanted one afternoon with her daughter. I understood the ache behind that request. I also understood what happened after the afternoon ended. Celia would wait for the next one. I told Meredith that if she wanted back in, she needed to come back in a way Celia could trust. There was no shouting, no slammed door, no dramatic declaration that she had lost her rights forever. Meredith looked at my parents' house for a long time. Then she looked at me. She said she could not make the promises I was asking for, and she left. Again. For several weeks afterward, I expected another call. None came. Then months passed. Eventually, I stopped expecting one. What I had never done was tell Celia her mother had been 30 feet away from her that afternoon. At first, the decision had felt obvious. Celia was 6. She had already survived the kind of abandonment adults spend entire lives trying to explain. Telling her that her mother had returned, but had not been willing to build a dependable way back into her life, seemed needlessly cruel. One abandonment was enough. That was how I justified it. Later, when Celia was 10, there was never a right moment. At 13, Meredith felt like history. At 16, Celia was busy building a life that belonged to her. At 18, I thought if she wanted more details, she would ask. I answered the things she asked. I simply never volunteered that afternoon. I was standing in my kitchen in 2026, with Paul watching me and Meredith's accusations spreading through the world. The excuse sounded thinner than it had in my head. I had not lied. I had edited. The distinction made my stomach turn. Paul did not tell me I had done something unforgivable. He did not need to. He asked whether Celia knew Meredith had ever tried to come back. I shook my head. Before either of us could say more, my phone vibrated. Not a reporter. Celia's manager. The message was short. Meredith had contacted the management office, asking that something be forwarded directly to Celia. They had not given Meredith Celia's private number. They had simply passed along the message and let Celia decide whether to respond. I knew what it said before Celia came downstairs. Not the words, the shape of it. She appeared in the kitchen holding her phone so tightly the tendons stood out along the back of her hand. She did not show it to Paul. She held it toward me. Meredith's message filled only one line. Ask Joanna why she never told you I came back for you. The kitchen seemed to shrink around us. Celia looked at me. She did not ask whether Meredith was lying. That hurt more than if she had. Her face already told me she had seen something in mine. I set the electricity bill down. Then I told her, not every memory, not every excuse, just the fact first. Meredith had come back once, about 19 months after the transplant. She had come to my parents' house. She had wanted to see Celia. We had told her that re-entering Celia's life needed structure and consistency. Meredith had not been willing to commit to that, and she had left again. Celia listened without interrupting. I reached the part where I explained she had been young and anxious and still healing from everything that had happened. I heard myself beginning to use the language of protection. I stopped, because protection was what I had called it. That did not mean Celia had experienced it as protection. She moved to the kitchen table and sat down. Her phone rested face up beside her hand with Meredith's message still visible. I told her the truth I could no longer dress up. I had believed one abandonment was enough. Her eyes lifted to mine. You decided that for me. There was no anger in her voice. That was what made the sentence land. I had spent the entire morning furious, because Meredith had turned Celia's life into a public thing and told the world what it meant without Celia's permission. Now, my niece was sitting across from me telling me I had done something smaller, kinder in intention, but built from the same dangerous assumption, that I knew which version of her own life she should be allowed to carry. I sat opposite her. The coffee mug from morning was still near the sink. Someone had moved the phones away from the table. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the patio dark and shining. I wanted to tell Celia how different the two things were. Meredith had abandoned her. I had stayed. Meredith was lying publicly. I had tried to keep a 6-year-old from waiting beside a window for someone who had already proven she could leave. All of that was true. None of it gave me back the choice I had made for Celia. I told her I was sorry, not because protecting a child had been wrong, because I had let a decision made for a 6-year-old survive long after she stopped being 6. Celia did not forgive me. She did not reject me either. She sat there for several minutes, then asked practical questions. How long Meredith had stayed, whether she had seen Celia, whether anyone had physically stopped her from entering the house, whether there had been a court order preventing contact. I answered only what I knew. No, Meredith had not seen her. No, there had not been some secret order banning her from the family forever. Yes, Dad had been angry and hostile. Yes, I had told Meredith that random appearances were not enough. Yes, Meredith had walked away. Again. Celia absorbed each answer with the concentration she usually reserved for difficult music. By the time she stood, something between us had changed. Not broken, shifted. That was more frightening. She told me she was going to meet Meredith. The words entered the room quietly. My first reaction formed so quickly it nearly became speech. I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell her Meredith had already manipulated a television audience. I wanted to offer to go with her and sit at another table. I wanted to wait outside, drive her there, and drive her home, to be close enough to step in if Meredith hurt her. My mouth opened. Then I stopped. Celia watched the struggle happen on my face. She told me the meeting would be in a public place. She had arranged it through the same management contact Meredith had used. She was not asking whether I thought it was wise. She was not asking permission. 20 years old, not 5. I had spent 15 years standing between Celia and every danger I could reach. Some dangers were real. Some were memories. Some were people. And some, I was beginning to understand, could be created by the very act of standing there too long. I swallowed the offer to accompany her. The words I finally managed were the hardest ones I had said all day. You don't need my permission. Celia looked at me for a moment. Then she picked up her coat. I heard the front door open and close. Through the window, I watched the young woman I had once carried home from hospital appointments walk toward her car to meet the mother who had left her there. Every instinct in me wanted to follow. I stayed where I was, for the first time since Celia was 5 years old. Protecting her meant accepting that I could not stand between her and the truth. After Celia drove away to meet Meredith, I discovered that restraint had a sound. It was the sound of my own phone staying face down on the kitchen counter. For the first 20 minutes, I found reasons to pass it. I wiped a counter that was already clean. I folded a dish towel twice, unfolded it, then folded it properly. I carried a stack of unopened mail into the dining room and brought it back because I could not remember why I had moved it. Paul did not tell me to calm down. That was one of the reasons I had married him. He knew there was nothing calm about watching the young woman I had raised drive toward someone who had spent 15 years absent from her life. 48 hours on television had not erased those 15 years. Still, he also knew calling Celia every 10 minutes would prove the wrong thing. So he made coffee neither of us wanted, and graded science papers at the table while I pretended to read. Mara came home from school a little after 3. She dropped her backpack by the stairs, noticed both of us still in the kitchen, and slowed down just enough for me to see that she was assessing the room before deciding what kind of daughter she needed to be. That should have bothered me more than it did at the time. She said she had homework and disappeared upstairs. I heard the door to her room close softly. Celia did not return until nearly 6. By then the gray October light had already drained from the windows. Her car pulled into the driveway. I saw it from the living room. I pressed my fingertips against the back of a chair to keep from going outside before she reached the door. When she came in, she looked neither devastated nor relieved. That frightened me more. Her coat was buttoned wrong by one button. She had not noticed. She took off her shoes, carried her bag into the kitchen, and sat at the table as though she had come home from a rehearsal that had gone longer than expected. I waited for her to speak first. She told me enough over the next hour to understand what Meredith had done. Not a confession, not a denial. Something more effective. She had told Celia a story built mostly from facts. According to Celia, Meredith had not tried to hug her at the cafe. She had not called her baby or behaved as if 15 years could be repaired by choosing the correct emotional line. She had looked nervous, older than she appeared on television, tired around the eyes. Celia had sat across from her and waited. Meredith began by admitting she had left the hospital. She described herself as 27 and widowed, exhausted and terrified that Celia was going to die despite everything the doctors were doing. She said she had reached a point where she could no longer walk into that hospital room without imagining a funeral. None of it contradicted what I remembered, which was exactly why her version was difficult to dismiss. A complete lie would have been easy. Meredith gave Celia truth in pieces, small enough to trust. She admitted signing temporary caregiving authority over to me. She admitted that I was already being evaluated as a donor. She admitted leaving Chicago. Then she changed the meaning. She told Celia she had believed she was stepping away temporarily. She said our parents and I had insisted we could manage the medical crisis better. She described the family as forceful, certain, organized around Celia's treatment in a way that made Meredith feel increasingly unnecessary. I could imagine how that sounded from the other side of a cafe table. I had been forceful. Dad had been worse. Mom had taken over everything Meredith stopped doing without waiting for permission. And once I became Celia's donor and guardian, the family structure had changed around us whether anyone intended it or not. Meredith did not need to invent those facts. She only needed to rearrange which one caused which. Celia told me Meredith had said she returned because she regretted leaving and wanted a path back. She described Dad's anger, Mom's fear that renewed contact would reopen wounds, and me telling her she could not simply appear one afternoon and expect Celia to fall back into her arms. Those facts were real. Then Meredith made the smallest turn. She said the family had already decided Celia was better off without her. I felt my stomach tighten when Celia repeated that, because I could not dismiss it cleanly. We had believed Celia was safer with stability. We had believed Meredith had not earned immediate access simply by returning. We had believed a 5-year-old, then 6-year-old child should not be forced to absorb the consequences of an adult's guilt. But believing that was not the same as stealing her child, Meredith understood the distance between those two things. She simply built a bridge across it. Celia had asked what Meredith did after she left my parents' house that second time. That was the question I had been waiting for. Meredith's answer, according to Celia, became less specific. She said she tried in different ways. She said she thought about contacting us repeatedly. She said she struggled with shame. She said every time she imagined calling, she heard my father telling her we would fight her return. She said she believed Celia had already been taught to see her as the woman who abandoned her. Celia asked whether Meredith had gone back to court. She had not. Whether she had hired an attorney to challenge my guardianship. She had not. Whether she had kept a regular record of trying to contact Celia. Meredith did not give her one. Instead, she returned to emotion. She had been afraid, ashamed, unwanted, convinced she would make things worse. That was not nothing. But it was not the same as being prevented. I could hear Celia making that distinction even as she told me. She was not defending Meredith. She was doing something much more difficult. She was refusing to let me make the distinction for her. I sat across from her and kept my hands flat on the table. There were at least 6 moments when I wanted to interrupt. I wanted to tell her Meredith could have contacted the court, that she knew exactly where we lived, that nobody had erased her name from the earth. That fear was not the same thing as force. Every statement would have been factually defensible. Every interruption would also have turned Celia's first attempt to understand her own history into another contest between 2 women telling her what it meant. So I listened. When she finished describing the first part of the meeting, she stared at a small scratch in the tabletop. Then she told me something I had not expected. Meredith had asked whether Celia wanted to meet Tessa. I had known, in the abstract, that Meredith had another daughter. I knew her name because it had appeared in pieces of public information over the years. But knowing a name existed was different from hearing Celia say it after sitting across from her biological mother. Tessa was 13, the same age as Mara. That parallel landed harder than it should have. Two 13-year-old girls. One had grown up in my house alongside the child Meredith left. The other had grown up in Meredith's house, hearing about the child she had supposedly lost. Celia had almost said no. Then she realized she was already sitting in a cafe trying to understand a past controlled by adults. Refusing to meet Tessa solely because of something Meredith had done would have repeated the same mistake in another direction. So she agreed to a short introduction. She told me Tessa walked in, as if someone had coached her on how to breathe around strangers. That description sounded so much like a 13-year-old that, despite everything, I almost smiled. Tessa did not arrive with a tidy speech about sisterhood. She did not tell Celia she had dreamed of this day. She hesitated for a few seconds, then looked at the young woman she had apparently seen online and blurted out, "You're shorter than you look online." Then her face went bright red. Celia laughed, not because the comment was especially funny, because tension had been holding every muscle in her body since morning, and something inside finally slipped. Tessa immediately started apologizing, which only made it worse. Celia told her it was fine. By the time the embarrassment passed, the two of them had managed something Meredith and I had not. They had spent 30 seconds together without turning the past into a weapon. Tessa told Celia, in the loose and uneven way teenagers tell stories, that Meredith mentioned her every year around her birthday. Sometimes there had been a cake no one explained very well. Sometimes Meredith had been quiet for a day. Tessa had always known there was an older sister somewhere. The version Tessa had been given was simple. Their mother had lost Celia during a terrible family conflict. Meredith's relatives had taken over while Celia was sick. Then they had kept her. Tessa did not say any of this as accusation. That mattered. She believed it. Celia told me that was the first moment she truly understood how long Meredith's story had existed outside our family. This was not something invented yesterday for television. A child had grown up inside it. A few minutes later, Graham arrived to collect Tessa. I had never met him. Everything I knew about that moment came from what Celia told me after she returned. Later, I would learn more from things Graham himself would eventually say. That evening, all I knew was that he had behaved decently. He did not try to make Celia call Meredith her mother. He did not act offended by her distance. He did not defend his wife with a list of excuses. He introduced himself, made sure Tessa had not overwhelmed Celia, and told Celia he understood if she wanted nothing to do with any of them. According to Celia, the sentence that stayed with her was not dramatic. Graham said he had always known Meredith had another daughter. He believed Meredith had lost her. He had believed that for years. The word believed lodged in me. Not claimed, not pretended, believed. Graham had not been there in 2011. He had entered Meredith's life after her failed return to our parents' house. He had no hospital memory, no first-hand knowledge of the guardianship, no experience of what happened before he met her. He had only Meredith's version. He had built a marriage beside that story. I went to bed that night with a strange discomfort I could not name. Meredith's lies would have been easier to understand if everyone around her had been cruel. If Graham had been arrogant, I could have dismissed him. If Tessa had repeated her mother's accusation like a slogan, I could have placed her neatly on the other side. But they were not on another side. They were people. People who had been told a story. That complicated everything. The next morning, Celia left early for rehearsal. She barely spoke before going. Not hostile. Not warm. There was a carefulness between us now that had never existed before Meredith appeared on television. I kept wanting to fix it. That urge was becoming familiar. Paul left for school after reminding me, gently, that trying to repair something before Celia understood what had broken would only make her feel managed again. I resented him for being right. Then I noticed Mara's backpack still sitting beside the stairs. She had already gone to school. That meant she had left without it. I grabbed my phone to call her, then saw a message from Paul that had arrived 20 minutes earlier. Mara had texted him directly. A classmate's mother had driven back past our house and picked up the backpack for her. Problem solved. No need for Mom. I stood there staring at the message. At first it seemed almost funny. Mara had forgotten her backpack and somehow organized a retrieval operation before I even noticed. Then I remembered the sandwich she had made herself the day before while our phones rang. The quiet way she had disappeared upstairs. The number of times in the last year she had arranged rides with friends' parents because Celia had rehearsals, interviews, performances, or travel. That was what made the pattern difficult to see. Mara was competent. Competence is one of the easiest qualities in a child to reward until you begin to rely on it too much. When she came home that afternoon, I asked how school had gone. She said fine. I asked about the backpack. She shrugged and told me she had handled it. I almost praised her. Then Paul came into the room. He had apparently learned there was more to the story. One of Mara's teachers had emailed because she had also missed turning in a form connected to a school activity. Not serious, not disciplinary, just unusual for her. Paul asked why she had not told either of us the night before. Mara's answer came while she was taking a container out of the refrigerator. She did not sound wounded. She sounded practical. Celia had bigger problems. The words were ordinary. The way she said them was not. There was no accusation in her face. She had simply arranged the household's priorities in her mind and placed herself where she believed she belonged. Below the emergency, I watched her close the refrigerator door. Something inside me shifted uneasily. I had spent years thinking of Mara as the child who did not require crisis management. Healthy, stable, easy. I had never asked what she had learned from being rewarded for staying that way. Before I could pursue it, Celia came through the front door. She had barely set down her music bag before asking if Grandma Elaine was home. I knew immediately this was not about dinner. The meeting with Meredith had not satisfied her. It had widened the question. Celia did not ask me to explain more. That choice hurt in a quiet place. Instead, she went upstairs and called my mother directly. I stayed downstairs. That mattered. I could have texted Mom first, warned her what Celia might ask, reminded her what we had agreed 2 years ago. I did none of it. For the next 15 minutes, I heard only the muted rhythm of Celia's voice through the ceiling. Then silence. A minute later, she came downstairs carrying her phone. Her expression made my hands go cold. She put the call on speaker. She had asked my mother if she was comfortable with me hearing the rest. Mom agreed. Her voice sounded older than it had the week before. Celia asked one question. Not whether Meredith loved her. Not whether I had been right. Not whether our family had stolen her. She asked what had happened when Meredith came back, that I still had not told her. There was a long silence from the phone. I pictured my mother in her own kitchen, probably standing beside the counter where she had spent years cutting apples for Celia after appointments, because hospital food had ruined her tolerance for anything soft and beige. When Mom finally spoke, she did not defend herself first. She said Meredith had come back once. Celia reminded her that she already knew that part. Another silence. Then my mother said something I had not expected. Your mother came back once, but the worst thing we did wasn't refusing to pretend nothing had happened. Celia's eyes stayed on the phone. Mom explained that after Meredith left the second time, Celia had continued asking about her. We had all agreed not to tell her Meredith had been there. Not just me. All of us. Dad because he was furious. Mom because she believed waiting for Meredith would hurt Celia. Me because I believed one abandonment was enough. We had called the decision stability, protection, peace. No one had called it what Celia was beginning to call it now. Control. By the time my mother finished, the silence in our kitchen felt different from the silence after the television clip. That morning, Meredith had made me the villain in a story that was not true. Now Celia had discovered something far more uncomfortable. My sister had rewritten the past to escape responsibility. But the rest of us had also decided which parts of that past a little girl was allowed to know. For the rest of that evening, nobody in my kitchen tried to make the word protection carry more weight than it could. Mom explained that the original decision had grown out of counseling, stability, and fear that a 6-year-old would spend every morning waiting for a mother who might disappear again. She admitted she had been the most determined to keep Meredith's failed return quiet. Dad agreed, because anger made silence feel cleaner than reopening the door. And I agreed, because I could not bear the thought of Celia waiting for another return. There had been no formal family vote. One conversation became another. Then enough time passed that silence became easier than explanation. Celia listened with one leg tucked beneath her, hearing adults reconstruct the childhood they had once decided she was too young to understand. When Mom finally said she had believed we were giving Celia peace, Celia looked toward me and then back at the phone. "You gave me the version that gave all of you peace." My mother made a small sound on the other end of the line. Not an argument, not even disagreement, just the sound of something landing. When the call ended, Celia remained at the table. Paul had taken Mara upstairs earlier. We were not keeping secrets from her. 13-year-olds do not need to be seated inside every adult reckoning. The house had settled into nighttime sounds around us. The heat turned on, pipes ticked somewhere behind the wall, and a car passed slowly outside on the wet street. Celia asked about Grandpa next. Not what he remembered. What he had done. I told her Dad had been furious when Meredith appeared in 2012. His fury had probably shaped the entire encounter. It did so before Meredith and I ever walked to the end of the driveway. Celia wanted to hear it from him. So the next afternoon we drove to my parents' house. She did not ask me to come because she needed protection. She asked because she wanted the people involved in the conversation to hear one another directly. That distinction mattered. Dad was in the garage when we arrived. He pretended to reorganize tools he had arranged the same way for at least 15 years. Mom had clearly warned him we were coming. The workbench had been cleared, and 2 mugs of coffee sat untouched beside the vise. Celia did not ease him into the subject. She asked what he had said to Meredith when she returned. Dad's face tightened. I had watched my father age in ordinary increments. Gray hair, slower stares, reading glasses that migrated from room to room, but guilt added years faster. He admitted he had threatened to fight Meredith every step if she disrupted Celia's life again. He had not been talking about violence. He meant court, lawyers, guardianship, every legal barrier he could find. But at the time, the words had been harsher than the legal reality. Dad had no authority to erase Meredith from Celia's life by personal decree. I was the guardian. A court order existed. Meredith had options if she truly wanted to challenge that arrangement. Still, Dad had made himself sound like a wall. He told Celia he had wanted Meredith to understand that showing up once did not repair 19 months of absence. Celia asked whether he wanted Meredith back in her life. Dad stared at the pegboard above his workbench. Finally, he said he wanted Meredith to prove she could stay. He did not want Celia to risk believing her again. That answer was honest. It was also more complicated than a clean family legend. Dad had not kidnapped anyone. He had not secretly blocked letters or moved Celia across the country. But he had absolutely wanted Meredith kept at a distance until she satisfied standards he believed she had earned. Meredith could truthfully say her family did not welcome her return. She could truthfully say my father threatened to fight her. She could truthfully say, I refused to hand Celia over for an unscheduled reunion. The lie began only when those truths were rearranged into captivity. On the drive home, Celia said very little. I watched autumn trees pass beyond the windshield, leaves collecting in gutters and along the edges of suburban roads. A few weeks earlier, I would have filled the silence. I would have explained what Dad meant. I would have reminded her Meredith could have gone to court. Instead, I let Celia think. She was not confused in the way Meredith's television appearance suggested. She was separating things. That night, Celia sat at our kitchen table with no documents in front of her and rebuilt the sequence aloud. Meredith had left during the medical crisis, after signing temporary authority to me. I later became court-appointed guardian when she did not resume parenting. She returned once. Our family resisted sudden access. Dad threatened to fight her. I demanded consistency, and Meredith left again when she could not promise it. Celia rested her fingertips against the wood grain, separating what had actually happened from what each of us had made it mean. They didn't welcome you back could be true. They stole me isn't. I felt something in my chest loosen, not because she had chosen my side, because she had stopped treating the history as something that required one side. The relief lasted less than a minute. Celia looked at me and asked why I had not told her when she was older. Not 6. Not 10. Older. That was the question I had been avoiding even in my own head. It would have been easy to defend what I did when she was small. Children cannot carry every adult truth at once. Sometimes parents and guardians make decisions about timing because children do need protection. But Celia had not stayed 6. By 12, she understood abandonment. By 15, she had asked questions about Meredith that I answered honestly but narrowly. By 18, she had the legal right to every relationship in her life. And still, I never sat down and told her that her mother had once returned. The original decision had been about protecting a child. The later silence had been about protecting something else. Stability. My fear. The life we had built. Maybe even the version of our family in which I knew where everyone belonged. I told Celia that as the years passed, the conversation became harder to begin. Every birthday that went by without Meredith made the old visit feel less relevant. Every good year made me less willing to reopen the bad one. That explanation sounded ugly because it was honest. I had chosen the peace of the present over the completeness of her past. Celia's mouth tightened. That was still a choice about my life that I didn't get to make. I nodded. There was nothing useful to add. Apologies become selfish when the person who caused the hurt keeps talking until they are forgiven. So I stopped. For the next few days, Celia continued asking questions, but the direction changed. She did not keep interrogating me. She called my parents separately. She asked Ruth Kaplan what had appeared publicly about Meredith before the television segment. She asked her management team to preserve messages Meredith sent, but not to respond on her behalf. She communicated with Tessa directly. In short, cautious exchanges that did not pass through either mother. The first evidence that this was affecting Meredith came indirectly. Celia showed me a message from Tessa one evening. It was not dramatic. Tessa said her mother had become upset after learning she and Celia were still texting. Meredith had apparently asked what they were discussing and whether Celia was putting ideas in her head. Celia had not. Tessa was beginning to ask her own questions. Around the same time, Graham reached out through Celia's management contact and asked whether he could speak with Paul. He did not accuse us of anything. He wanted dates. That detail told me more than anger would have. For years, Meredith had been able to tell Graham how events felt. Now he wanted to know when they happened. Paul took the call without me in the room. He summarized it afterward. Graham had asked whether Meredith's return to my parents' home occurred before or after the guardianship became long-term. He asked whether anyone had a permanent order prohibiting contact, whether we had changed addresses during those years. Paul told him only what he personally knew, and made clear he had not been present in 2011 or at Meredith's return. For the older history, Graham would need to ask me, or my parents, or review lawful records. The fact that he was checking at all mattered. A story built from emotion survives as long as nobody asks for chronology. Meredith's public language began shifting too. Ruth called me after seeing a shorter follow-up interview Meredith gave online. She was careful not to make claims she could not support. She noticed the same thing I did when we watched the clip. Meredith had become more specific in some places and less specific in others. She still said I had taken Celia. She still used the word kidnapping. But when asked whether she had ever returned to the family home, she spoke about how unwelcome she had felt. She said the family had been closed. She did not say no. That omission stood out. Her first interview had framed 15 years, as though she never knew where her child was. A few days later, Ruth contacted me again. One of Meredith's colleagues at the nonprofit had spoken to her on background after noticing the same contradiction. Years earlier, Meredith had apparently mentioned returning to her parents' home and being unable to re-enter her daughter's life. The colleague remembered because Meredith had used the story in a small staff discussion about family estrangement. Now, on television, Meredith was saying she had been deprived of her daughter's whereabouts. The colleague had asked Meredith about the mismatch. Meredith blamed the media. According to Ruth, she said television compressed complicated stories. It made her words sound more absolute than she intended. That explanation might have worked if the word kidnapped had come only from a producer's graphic. It had not. Meredith had said it herself. Still, none of us had heard the private workplace conversation directly. I refused to treat a second-hand recollection as proof of anything. Ruth understood. She was building her own reporting. I was trying not to build a prosecution in my kitchen. What mattered was the pattern. People were beginning to talk to one another without Meredith translating. Tessa talked to Celia. Graham asked Paul when. Ruth compared public statements. My parents answered Celia directly. The spaces between Meredith's versions were becoming visible. I tried to imagine what that must have felt like for her. I stopped myself. I did not know what Meredith felt. I knew what she did next. 3 days later, her attorney sent a written demand through Celia's management team, asking that certain public descriptions of the 2011 abandonment be corrected. The language avoided specifics about the hospital and focused on Meredith being excluded from later decisions. Our lawyer told us not to respond emotionally. We did not. Then the television network posted a clarification, saying Meredith stood by her assertion that her daughter had been unlawfully taken from her. Still, we did not respond publicly beyond the narrow factual statement already prepared through counsel. The next move belonged to Meredith. She crossed a line I had not expected her to cross. I did not learn about it from television. I learned on a Tuesday afternoon while shelving returned books. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I usually ignored personal calls while on the floor, but the number displayed a local area code, and the voicemail preview included my full name. I stepped into the staff room and listened. A detective from a Chicago area law enforcement agency was asking me to return his call regarding a report filed by Meredith Mercer. The word report made my throat go dry. I called our lawyer first. By the time I spoke to the detective later that day, counsel was involved, and the conversation stayed controlled. The detective did not say I was about to be arrested. He did not claim some 15-year-old case had suddenly been reopened for prosecution. He explained that Meredith had made a formal allegation, and that he needed to verify facts surrounding it. The allegation was not framed the way Meredith had framed it in the softer moments of television interviews. It was specific. According to the report, I had taken Celia from the hospital without lawful authority. Meredith claimed she had never voluntarily given me authority to care for her daughter. She claimed I concealed where Celia was living. She claimed she spent years unable to locate her. I sat in the lawyer's office with my phone on speaker between us and stared at the grain of the conference table. Those were not interpretations. They were assertions, and Meredith knew at least 3 of them were false, because she had lived through the facts herself. She had signed the temporary caregiving authority before she left. Celia had remained connected to the same family address Meredith had known. And 19 months later, Meredith had physically returned to that exact house. The detective's tone stayed neutral. He asked whether I had documentation or witnesses who could help establish the sequence. My lawyer answered most of the procedural questions and arranged for a formal interview. Nobody promised an outcome. Nobody told me Meredith was in trouble. Nobody told me I was safe, simply because I knew the truth. But the shape of the conflict had changed. Until that moment, Meredith had been telling a story about what the past meant. Now, she had told law enforcement what she claimed had happened. There is a difference between saying, "My family pushed me out," and saying, "My sister took my child without authority." There is a difference between saying, "I felt kept away," and saying, "She hid my daughter so I could not find her." Emotion can survive contradiction. Facts have to survive verification. When the call ended, my lawyer closed his notebook. He reminded me that the point of the next steps was not to relitigate every family wound from 2011. Authorities would have to understand enough of the history to evaluate the complaint Meredith had just made. The live question was what she reported now, and whether those claims had any reasonable basis. I barely heard the rest. For 15 years, I had worried that Meredith might someday return and demand a place in Celia's life. I had imagined custody threats when Celia was younger, court arguments, emotional manipulation, the possibility that Celia might want her, and I would have to accept it. I had never imagined my sister would walk into a police station and turn her absence into my crime. On the drive home, the late afternoon sky hung low over the expressway. Cars crawled beneath the gray October light, brake lamps flaring red ahead of me. My phone stayed untouched in the passenger seat. At home, Celia was at the piano. She was not rehearsing a full piece. She was repeating a short passage. She stopped each time something sounded wrong, went back and separated the mistake from the rest. I stood outside the room and listened. For years, I had watched her do that with music. Find the wrong note, identify where it entered, refuse to blame the entire piece. That was what she had been doing with our history. My father's anger was real. My silence was real. My mother's fear was real. Meredith's abandonment was real. They did not cancel one another, and none of them turned guardianship into kidnapping. Celia stopped playing when she saw me. I told her Meredith had filed a formal police report. The color left her face. I did not give her legal jargon. I told her only what mattered. The report said I had taken her from the hospital without authority, hidden where she lived, and kept Meredith from finding her. Celia looked toward the piano keys. Then she looked back at me. She knew Meredith had signed the temporary authority. She knew Meredith had come to our family home later. She did not need me to tell her what that contradiction meant. Neither of us said the word lie. We did not have to. For the first time since this began, the danger was no longer only that Meredith could convince strangers of her version. She had handed that version to people whose job was to check whether the facts underneath it existed. And now a detective was calling me. My sister had taken a 15-year-old family wound and formally reported it as kidnapping. The detective did not come to my house. By morning, after a night of useless sleep, I had imagined police cars outside before Mara left for school and co-workers watching me be escorted through the library. Reality was quieter. My lawyer arranged the interview in his office, and Paul drove because I had spent breakfast moving the same piece of toast around my plate without eating it. Celia wanted to come. I told her this first meeting was about Meredith's report against me, not a test of Celia's loyalty, and she accepted that. The detective arrived with a slim notebook and explained that he was verifying specific claims. My lawyer made the boundary clear before we began. Nobody was treating me as though a 15-year-old kidnapping prosecution had suddenly awakened. The old history mattered because Meredith had used it to support a report she filed now. That was the live question. I gave the chronology without turning it into a family argument. The 2011 medical crisis, Meredith signed short-term authority, my donor evaluation, and Celia's transplant. The later guardianship proceeding after Meredith did not resume parenting, and the life Celia lived openly afterward. The detective did not need words like sacrifice or betrayal. He needed things that could be checked. There was no perfect folder labeled truth. The history was distributed across a court file, whatever medical records still existed, school and address records, and people who had been present. What mattered was the pattern. Celia had lived under her own name. She had gone to school, attended medical follow-up, and later entered community music programs without being hidden. Then the detective asked about late 2012. I told him Meredith had come to my parents' house about 19 months after the transplant. She knew the address because we had grown up there. She spoke to Dad and me, asked to see Celia, and left when she would not commit to a consistent re-entry plan. When he asked whether Meredith knew Celia was inside that house, I said yes. That single answer did more work than any dramatic accusation could have. A woman who physically returned to the house where her daughter was staying could not easily reconcile that act with a police report saying she had been unable to find her. I also told him the part that made me look less comfortable, not more. We had not told Celia about Meredith's return. I had kept that decision in place too long. The detective did not decide whether I had been a perfect guardian, because that was not what he was there to decide. A morally questionable choice about what to tell a child was not the same question as whether I had kidnapped her. After the interview, my lawyer explained the remaining issue in plain terms. An unsupported complaint was not automatically a crime. Memory could be faulty, and old conflicts could be interpreted differently. The harder question was what Meredith knew when she made factual claims to police. She could sincerely believe our family had pushed her out, or that Dad's anger frightened her. But she also knew she had signed temporary authority, knew the family address, and knew she had returned there. Investigators would have to decide whether the gap between her feelings and her report was deliberate. He did not promise me a charge. He told me to go home. For once, I listened. Paul had spent the interview sitting in the lobby with a stack of school papers he had brought to grade. When I came out, he looked at my face. He packed everything without asking how it went and drove. We stopped for coffee on the way home. I could not remember ordering mine. Halfway through the drive, Paul asked whether there was anything new. I told him the detective seemed most interested in the temporary authority, the guardianship history, and Meredith's 2012 return. Paul kept his eyes on traffic. He had entered our lives after the transplant. He had never pretended to know the beginning firsthand. That humility had become unexpectedly valuable now. Unlike the rest of us, he had no childhood version to defend. At home, Celia waited until I had put down my bag before asking how the interview had gone. I summarized it. She listened most carefully when I explained that no single document was going to settle everything. The short-term authority mattered. The court guardianship mattered. Her school and medical continuity could matter. Meredith returning to the house mattered. But none of those facts alone could tell a complete story. Celia nodded. Then she asked when the detective might want to speak with her. I told her probably soon. She looked toward the piano. I knew what she was thinking, only because she told me. She did not remember enough. That frightened her. She had been 5. Her memories of the hospital existed like isolated photographs without captions. The smell of sanitizer, a television mounted too high on the wall, Grandma peeling an apple, my hand resting beside hers after one of us had been moved from surgery, and the other was awake enough to visit. She remembered Meredith in pieces too. A coat, perfume, a voice near the door. She could not reconstruct who signed what, who said what to doctors, or exactly which day someone stopped showing up. For years I had been grateful she did not remember more. Now she worried her missing memory might leave space for Meredith's version. I told her not to fill it. Her face tightened. I repeated it. Do not guess. Do not turn fragments into certainty, because you think certainty will help me. She looked surprised. Maybe she had expected me to want loyalty. The truth was, I had never wanted her to lie for me. But after everything she had learned about the parts I withheld, I understood why she might question that. The detective interviewed Celia 2 days later. I did not sit beside her. She was 20. She had counsel available if needed, and could answer for herself. What I knew afterward came from what she chose to tell me. She said her memories were incomplete. She remembered being sick. She remembered me being present more consistently than Meredith. She remembered recovery. She did not claim to remember her mother signing temporary authority. She did not claim to remember Meredith announcing she was leaving. She did not say she could personally verify every legal step. When asked whether she remembered being hidden from Meredith, she said she did not remember anything that felt like hiding, but she would not transform that impression into proof. That answer hurt and made me proud at the same time. There had been a moment, she told me, when the detective asked whether she believed I kidnapped her. Celia paused before answering, not because she suspected me, because she understood belief was not evidence. She told him that everything she had since learned was inconsistent with kidnapping, but that she was not going to invent 5-year-old memories to strengthen anybody's case. I had spent years wanting to raise a child who could think for herself. It turned out that meant accepting her independence, even when it refused to serve me. The investigation moved slowly after that. Records and statements accumulated instead of arriving as one dramatic proof. The guardianship history showed notice and process. Address and school information showed a child living openly. My parents confirmed the broad sequence while admitting their own anger and mistakes. Most importantly, Meredith's 2012 return placed her at the very address her report later suggested she could not find. The history remained messy, but the concealment story became harder to sustain. The first real shift outside our family came from Graham. He contacted Paul again. This time, he asked whether he could speak with both of us. We agreed to a phone call. I expected defensiveness. Instead, Graham sounded tired. He explained that a detective had asked him what Meredith had told him over the years. He had answered as accurately as he could, which forced him to hear his own memories differently. Years earlier, Meredith had told him she once went back to her parents' home, but could not bring herself to go inside and face the family. That was not how I remembered the day. She had been on the property. She had spoken to us. Still, even Graham's version contained one devastating fact. She knew where the house was. She knew where her family was. She had known enough to return. The police report said she could not find Celia. Graham had not called to apologize for believing his wife. He was not ready for that. He wanted to know whether the report really said Meredith had been unable to locate her daughter for years. My lawyer had advised me not to discuss the investigation beyond what was necessary. I did not repeat every detail. I told him only that the allegation included concealment and an inability to find Celia. Silence followed. Then Graham said something that sounded more like shock than anger. It sounded like a man realizing the ground had shifted beneath him. Which version did she tell the police? The question was not really for me. Paul knew it too. We did not answer. Graham ended the call a few minutes later. Afterward, Paul remained standing beside the kitchen counter with his arms folded. He said Graham wasn't looking to take a side. He was looking for a chronology. That was the difference between defending someone and verifying them. I thought about Tessa, 13 years old enough to notice tension between her parents, not old enough to deserve the burden causing it. I did not feel satisfaction. Meredith's story was beginning to crack inside the life she had built. Innocent people were living in that house. That made the consequences feel less like revenge and more like gravity. Then Ruth Kaplan called. She had been going backward through public material, old nonprofit panels, community talks, archived interviews, and event recordings. She asked whether I knew Meredith had been speaking publicly about losing Celia years before Ruth's profile existed. I did not. The earliest clip showed a younger Meredith describing herself as a mother separated from a child during a period when her family believed they knew better. Years later, the language hardened. A daughter had been taken into the care of controlling relatives. Attempts to reconnect had been blocked. In another interview, still years before Celia drew national attention, Meredith spoke about understanding mothers who had been pushed out of their children's lives. None of those old clips proved the crime police were now examining. They showed something else. The story had been evolving for years. There had been no single day when Meredith invented a brand new past. Each version moved a little farther from the last, until the softer wording nearly disappeared. By 2026, she could say kidnapped beneath studio lights, as though the word had always belonged there. That chronology destroyed the easiest motive I had been holding on to. Celia's success had not created Meredith's story. It had threatened it. For years, Meredith could describe a daughter who existed in her present life, mostly as absence a private wound. No one around her could verify. Then Celia became an adult with a public name, her own voice, and a history capable of answering back. By the time I closed the last clip, I knew I was not confronting a lie invented because Celia became famous. I was looking at an identity Meredith had been building almost as long as I had been raising the child she left behind. The first visible consequence of Ruth's discovery was not a new revelation about 2011. It was watching people in Meredith's present life stop accepting her version without checking it. Her marriage, her work, and Tessa's understanding of Celia had all grown around the story in different ways. Now those relationships were beginning to move, without Meredith controlling the route between them. The first person in Meredith's current life who began crossing that line was Graham. He did not suddenly call me and announce that he believed every word I said. That would have been easier. Instead, he started checking. The second phone conversation we had with him lasted less than 20 minutes. Graham asked when Meredith had returned to my parents' house, whether she knew I was already Celia's guardian, and whether any order had permanently barred her from contact. I answered only what I knew firsthand. Late 2012, yes to the guardianship, and no to a permanent ban. There had been boundaries, counseling advice, and plenty of family anger, but not a secret legal wall. Graham did not defend Meredith. He also did not recruit me into his marriage. He was trying to find where his own knowledge ended. Paul, who had not been present in 2011 either, said so plainly. That restraint seemed to matter to Graham. When the call ended, I was left with the contrast between two husbands who had entered the story later. Paul knew where second-hand knowledge stopped. Graham was only beginning to discover how much of his marriage rested on it. A few days later, the first visible consequence reached Meredith's work. It came through a public statement from the nonprofit where she served as Director of Family Advocacy. I saw the statement because Ruth sent me the link. It was restrained to the point of sounding bloodless. The organization acknowledged the public allegations involving Meredith and confirmed that she had been placed on administrative leave while the board reviewed the matter. It said it would not comment further, while law enforcement questions remained unresolved. No condemnation, no triumphant firing, no declaration that she was a fraud, just distance. That was appropriate. It also told me the story had finally become too dangerous for her employer to absorb without checking. Ruth explained later that the board was reviewing not only the television interview, but the ways Meredith had used her personal history in public talks and fundraising contexts over the years. That did not mean every donation was fraudulent or every speech had been a lie. The organization had to distinguish between a personal narrative used to build credibility and any formal misrepresentation that might affect its work. I was glad they were being careful. If Meredith had built her life by replacing complexity with certainty, I did not want anyone punishing her by doing the same thing in reverse. Still, administrative leave carried its own message. Credibility had been part of her job. Now credibility was the thing under review. Celia learned about the leave through Ruth before Meredith mentioned it to her. By then, Celia and Tessa had been exchanging messages every few days. I did not ask to read them. That was deliberate. After everything that had happened, I had begun to understand how easily concern could disguise itself as entitlement. If Celia wanted to tell me what they discussed, she did. If she did not, I let the silence belong to her. One evening, she came into the kitchen while I was cutting vegetables and held her phone against her chest for several seconds before speaking. Tessa had contacted her, without Meredith knowing. The message was short. "I don't know what's true anymore. Can I still talk to you?" Celia had answered yes. Nothing about that exchange sounded dramatic. That was why it mattered. For 13 years, whatever Tessa knew about Celia had reached her through Meredith. Now she was asking Celia directly. One relationship had slipped out from under the story. A week later, Celia met Tessa again. I was not there. Everything I knew afterward came from what Celia chose to tell me. They met in a public place with adult logistics handled appropriately. Tessa did not arrive carrying revelations. She did not interrogate Celia about our family. Mostly she talked about school, music she actually liked, and the embarrassment of having a mother whose face had recently appeared on television often enough that classmates had started recognizing her. Then, slowly, Meredith entered the conversation. Tessa said her mother had always remembered Celia's birthday. Some years she became quiet. Some years she cried after Tessa went to bed. There had been a photograph once in a drawer that Tessa knew not to ask about too often. Celia listened. That part hurt her. I could see it even as she told me. It would have been easier if Meredith had forgotten her. A woman who never looked back could be understood as simply cruel. A woman who missed the child she abandoned was harder. Celia had grown up assuming absence meant indifference. Tessa's memories suggested something messier. Meredith had felt loss. She had carried regret. She had apparently marked birthdays. The problem was what happened after the regret. Celia asked Tessa what Meredith had actually done to come back. Not how often she cried. Not whether she kept pictures. What actions she took. Tessa did not know. She had heard that our family blocked contact. She had heard that Meredith had tried and been rejected. But she had never been given dates, court attempts, letters, lawyers, scheduled visits, or any clear account of sustained action. That absence of detail was not Tessa's fault. She had inherited the emotional version. Celia told me she had realized something simple. Missing someone was not the same as showing up for them. I did not answer with a lesson. She had already found it herself. The same week, Mara finally stopped being the child who required no attention. Not because she created a crisis, because I nearly repeated an old mistake. She had a school event scheduled for Thursday evening. Nothing prestigious. Nothing that would change her future. A small science showcase where students presented projects to parents, teachers, and anyone patient enough to stand beside folding tables in a fluorescent gym. Mara had reminded us about it twice. I had written it on the calendar. Then my lawyer called that afternoon. There had been movement in the police review. The detective wanted clarification on one part of Meredith's report. Counsel wanted to go through the wording with me before responding. My first thought was to move Mara's event, not cancel it. Just let Paul attend while I handled the legal issue. It happened so naturally that I was already reaching for my phone. Then, I saw the date circled on the calendar. For years, this had been the family rule. Nobody ever stated. If Celia had a medical appointment, the schedule moved. If Celia had a recital, the schedule moved. If Celia had a crisis, everyone understood. And Mara, because she was healthy and adaptable, had become the person least likely to object. I put the phone down. I told my lawyer I could speak later that evening. Then I went to the school. Mara saw me before I reached her table. The surprise on her face made me feel worse than accusation would have. She had not expected me. She had expected Paul. She had apparently accepted that as sufficient, before I had even failed her. Her project involved water quality testing. She explained it with the practiced confidence of a child who had already given the same presentation 15 times that evening. I listened to all of it, not while checking my phone, not while thinking about the detective. All of it. On the drive home, Paul asked why she had seemed so surprised that I came. Mara tried to dismiss it at first. After a long silence, she said the legal problem with Celia mattered more. I told her the legal problem was important. She looked out the window. That was not the answer she needed. At home, she finally said what had been developing quietly for years. She had learned to look fine, because looking fine was the easiest thing she could give me. The sentence passed through me without drama. No raised voice. No tears. Just a 13-year-old listing a skill she should never have needed. I thought about all the times I had praised her for being independent, all the times I had admired how little she demanded, all the times I had interpreted absence of need as evidence that I was meeting it. Celia had spent years trying to become extraordinary because she believed survival had put her in debt. Mara had spent years trying to become easy because she believed our family already had enough weight. Two girls adjusting themselves around the same history, in opposite directions. I did not promise Mara some grand transformation. Children know when adults are making speeches because they feel guilty. I told her I should have noticed sooner. Then I asked what she wanted from me now. She shrugged at first. 13-year-olds are allowed to be bad at answering questions adults should have asked years earlier. Eventually, she said she wanted me to stop assuming she would understand everything. That was fair. On the way home from getting ice cream afterward, Mara's choice, not mine, Paul tried to release some of the pressure in the car. He glanced at the dark screen of my phone in the cup holder and said we had just made it through an entire hour without anyone saying the word kidnapping. Mara looked at the dashboard clock. You just ruined the record. Paul nodded solemnly, as if accepting a scientific correction. For the first time in days, I laughed, and guilt did not follow immediately behind. The sound felt strange, useful. We needed moments like that, not because anything had become less serious, because no family can survive indefinitely if the crisis is allowed to occupy every chair at the table. The legal matter kept moving whether I stared at my phone or not. Additional records and statements were checked, and the contradictions already established in Meredith's report did not disappear. Then my lawyer called one morning while I was matching socks in the laundry room. The detective wanted Meredith back for follow-up questioning, this time focused on what she had said to police and what she knew when she said it. Authorities were examining whether the report itself had been knowingly false. I sat on the clothes dryer, with a pair of Mara's socks in my hand. Part of me still wanted the investigation to become a clean contest me cleared. Meredith caught, but Graham, Tessa, her colleagues, and the families she may genuinely have helped made that impossible. Consequences would reach people who had not created the lie. That did not erase Meredith's responsibility. It only kept justice from feeling like revenge. That evening, Celia practiced in the living room, while Mara did homework at the table. Their ordinary sounds reminded me how much had already changed, without a verdict. Graham was verifying instead of defending. Tessa was talking to Celia directly. The nonprofit was reviewing Meredith's public history. And police were no longer treating her version as something that could simply be accepted. 2 days later, my lawyer said the detective had completed enough factual review to refer the false report issue for further consideration. Meredith's story had spent 15 years protecting her from the woman she had once been. Now that same story could make her the subject of a criminal case. Once the investigation turned toward Meredith's false report, I expected the pressure on Celia to ease. Instead, it changed shape. The accusation had entered the public world through Meredith, but by then it no longer belonged entirely to her. News sites had copied the television clip. Commentators had shortened 15 years into arguments that fit inside headlines. People who had never met any of us began attaching labels to Celia, as though naming her was the same as knowing her. The kidnapped pianist. The miracle transplant child. The daughter caught between two mothers. Some descriptions were sympathetic. A few were even technically accurate in pieces. That did not make them harmless. Celia had spent most of her life trying to become known for the way she played. Now strangers were deciding the most interesting thing about her had happened when she was 5. Her management team tried to protect the work. Requests unrelated to music were declined. Interviewers were told she would not discuss an active legal matter. Concert promoters were asked not to use the family scandal in advertising. Most respected the boundaries. Some found ways around them. A presenter introducing one of Celia's smaller appearances referred to her as a survivor in more ways than one. Another interviewer who had been approved to discuss a new performance asked, near the end, whether music had helped her cope with being at the center of a kidnapping controversy. Celia answered briefly and moved on. When she came home that night, she set her keys on the counter so carefully that I knew something was wrong. She did not complain about Meredith. She complained about being turned into a noun. Survivor, victim, miracle, prodigy. Each label flattened a complicated person into a prop for someone else's story. Even the people defending her began doing it. Online strangers praised that she had survived kidney failure and become an accomplished pianist. They treated her professional success like the final proof that saving her had been worthwhile. That bothered me more than criticism did. The praise carried something else beneath it. Look what she became, as if an ordinary life would have felt like a poor return on that cost. I did not understand yet how deeply Celia had absorbed that idea herself. I only saw the surface effects. Her practice schedule became harsher. She had always been disciplined, but discipline and punishment can look almost identical from outside. She started staying at the piano longer after mistakes. She added extra hours before rehearsals. She stopped taking breaks she would normally have defended. One night I woke after midnight and found the living room light still on. Celia sat at the piano wearing headphones, her hands moving silently across the keys. The instrument itself made no sound through the headphones, but I could hear her fingers striking wood. Again, again, again. I stood in the hallway long enough for her to sense me. She turned. I told her it was after midnight. She said she knew. I wanted to ask what she was trying to outrun. Instead, I pointed toward the clock. She took the headphones off. That was all. A week later, she had a rehearsal with Dr. Inez Valdez. Inez had known Celia long before national profiles and television accusations. She had first worked with her through a community music program when Celia was still small enough that her feet barely reached the pedals comfortably. By the time the scandal erupted, Inez was less a teacher than one of the few people in Celia's professional world who remembered what she sounded like before anyone cared whether she would become important. I was not at the rehearsal. What I know came from Celia afterward. She had been preparing a program for the large concert scheduled later that month. The music was familiar. She had played most of it before. Nothing about her body failed. Her transplanted kidney was stable. She was not sick. She reached a familiar passage she had played hundreds of times. She could not make herself continue, not because she forgot the notes, because she became aware of the room, the hall, the audience that would come, the reporters who might attend, Meredith potentially sitting somewhere among them. Me. Every meaning people had loaded onto the performance arrived at once. Her hands stopped. She tried again. The same thing happened. Then a third time. Inez closed the score. She did not ask Celia whether she was all right. She did not tell her to push through. According to Celia, Inez walked to the piano bench and reminded her of the first piece she had ever played all the way through without stopping. Celia remembered it. A simple children's arrangement. She had been furious because one hand had kept arriving before the other. I remembered too. She practiced until our old neighbors probably considered filing a complaint with the city. Inez asked why she had kept playing then. Celia gave several answers about improvement. Inez rejected all of them. She reminded Celia that at 7 she had no career to protect, no public to impress, no proof to provide. She played because she liked how the sound finally matched the music she heard in her head. That rehearsal ended early. When Celia told me about it, She sat on the edge of her bed, with her hands folded between her knees. For a pianist, her hands had always seemed unusually expressive even when still. I had watched them grow from small fingers wrapped around crayons to long, disciplined hands capable of making an auditorium go silent. That evening, they looked tired. She admitted she had begun wondering whether she even wanted the concert to happen. The question frightened her because piano had been the one part of her life she thought belonged entirely to her. Then Meredith came back. The media came. The investigation came. And suddenly the piano was being asked to carry everything. Proof that Celia had survived. Proof that I had raised her well. Proof that Meredith had lost something valuable. Proof that trauma could produce something beautiful. I sat beside her. The mattress dipped between us. I did not tell her to cancel. I did not tell her to continue. For once, I understood that both answers belonged to her. We sat quietly for several minutes. Then Celia said something I had never heard from her before. She had known about my kidney almost her entire conscious life. Not medically, emotionally. Adults mentioned it gently when she was little. Family friends called me amazing. Teachers learned the story. Other parents at competitions occasionally told her how lucky she was to have me. Nobody had ever stood over her and demanded repayment. That was precisely why I had not seen the debt take shape. Celia had created the demand herself. She looked down at her hands. You gave me part of your body. I had to become worth it. The air in the room felt thin. I thought of every trophy I had dusted, every competition result I had celebrated. Every time somebody introduced Celia as the girl who survived kidney failure and went on to do extraordinary things, I had heard inspiration. She had heard obligation. My first instinct was to deny it. I had never asked for repayment, and I had never donated a kidney so she could win competitions. But defending my intention would not explain how a child had interpreted the story everyone told about us. So I went back to the part nobody put in inspirational profiles. The mornings I hated getting out of bed, the grocery calculations, the nights I missed a life where only my own mistakes belonged to me. Staying had been a choice made repeatedly by an imperfect woman, not alone written into Celia's body. Then she asked the question that finally exposed how much weight she had been carrying. What if I'm ordinary after all this? I looked at the young woman beside me, 20 years old, already more accomplished than most people would ever become, and still frightened that ordinary life might somehow be a betrayal. Then you get to be ordinary. Her shoulders moved with one long breath. No dramatic collapse followed. She did not cry against me and declare herself healed. Patterns built over years do not disappear because someone says the right sentence once. But that night she closed the piano before midnight. The next day, she practiced less. Not badly, less. I began noticing the distinction between discipline and fear. So did she. A few evenings later, Mara wandered into Celia's room while I was putting laundry away down the hall. I was not trying to overhear them. Our house lacked the walls that would make privacy perfect. Their conversation drifted through the open doorway in fragments. Celia had told Mara some version of what we had discussed. Not every detail. Enough. Mara understood more than I expected, because she had been constructing her own version of the same family gravity. Celia had tried to become extraordinary because she believed she owed us something for surviving. Mara had tried to become easy, because she believed the family already had enough difficulty. One child performed upward. The other disappeared sideways. Both thought they were helping. I stopped folding one of Paul's shirts. The realization did not arrive as a sudden epiphany. It was there in the contrast between two girls sitting on a bedroom floor. Celia surrounded by music scores. Mara with one of her school notebooks open but ignored. I heard Mara tell her that if Celia was really serious about trying ordinary, she should prove it. Celia asked what counted as proof. Mara proposed skipping one self-imposed practice session to watch a terrible television show with her. Celia considered this. Then she said it sounded like a serious moral demand. The tone was the same grave one she used to discuss repertoire. Mara laughed. So did Celia. I walked away before they saw me listening. An hour later they were still downstairs, watching something so badly acted that Paul lasted 11 minutes before leaving the room. Nothing important happened. That was exactly the point. Celia did not need to transform every saved hour into accomplishment. Mara did not need to earn her place by asking for nothing. And for one evening, neither girl adjusted herself around the history of a hospital room from 15 years earlier. The outside world had not learned the same lesson. Requests for Celia to speak publicly became more aggressive as the investigation into Meredith's report developed. One television producer proposed an interview framed as Celia finally telling her side. Another went further. The program wanted Meredith invited too, a face-to-face conversation. 2 women, 1 daughter, truth revealed live. The format practically advertised itself. Celia's manager sent the proposal to her because she believed Celia should know what was being offered, rather than have opportunities hidden from her, for her own good. I appreciated the irony. Celia read the proposal once. Then she deleted it. She told the management team she would not appear. There was no family debate, no strategy meeting around whether television exposure might help my civil case. I would have refused to use her that way anyway. Celia made the decision before anyone asked. Her management released a short statement instead. The factual accusation was being handled through the appropriate legal processes. Celia would not litigate her childhood on television. That was all. No attack on Meredith. No declaration that I was the only parent who mattered. No emotional accounting of the transplant. The statement disappointed everyone who wanted spectacle. That made me like it. For the first time since Meredith went on television, Celia controlled part of the public narrative not by telling more. She refused to feed it. The strangest consequence was that her music began returning to her, not immediately, not completely, but she stopped treating every rehearsal as a referendum. Inez told her to choose one part of the concert program she would play, even if there were only 3 people in the audience. None of them needed to know her history. Celia chose the encore. When she told me, there was something lighter in her voice. She did not say what she had chosen. I did not ask. October moved toward its end. The legal review of Meredith's false report continued in the background. Our lawyer updated us when there was something meaningful. I stopped allowing every new legal email to dictate the emotional weather of the house. Meredith remained on administrative leave. Graham had become quieter. Tessa continued contacting Celia directly. None of those threads disappeared, but they stopped occupying every hour. Then, 5 days before the concert, Celia came home carrying 2 envelopes. One went into the basket with ordinary mail. She held the other. I was making dinner. Paul was correcting something Mara had done to a science worksheet. Mara insisted the problem was not her answer, but the teacher's badly worded question. Celia waited until that small argument ended. Then she told me the concert was going ahead. I had assumed it would. Her rehearsal had improved. Her management had confirmed the schedule. The venue, a formal solo recital with invited guests, and a planned encore, had already tightened backstage access because of the press attention. What I did not know was that Celia had been deciding who would sit inside the room. She told me she had sent Meredith a VIP invitation. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. My hand stopped above the cutting board. I looked at Celia. Her expression did not ask for approval. Months earlier, that alone might have triggered every protective instinct I had. Now I forced myself to wait. She explained that Meredith had spent weeks talking about Celia, without ever sitting in the same room with the person whose life she was describing. Celia wanted her there, not for confrontation, not so the audience could punish her. She simply wanted Meredith to hear what Celia chose to say next, without an interviewer, lawyer, or family member translating it afterward. I asked whether Tessa knew. Celia said she had made separate arrangements concerning Tessa, but did not explain them. That answer tightened something in me. I did not press. Then I asked the question I hated myself for needing to ask. What exactly was Celia planning to say? She looked at me for a long moment. There had once been a time when she would have answered because I asked. That time was gone. She slipped the second envelope onto the counter. Meredith's name was written on it. The invitation had already been sent electronically. The paper version was only a copy Celia had kept. My mind immediately started running through possibilities. Maybe Celia was going to acknowledge Meredith publicly. Maybe she wanted to call her mother. Maybe the investigation, the hidden return, and the complicated truth had changed the way she saw all of us. The fear came embarrassingly fast. After everything I had learned about letting Celia choose, part of me still wanted reassurance that her choice would end with me. She saw it. Of course she did. Celia had been reading my face since she was 5. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. I need her to hear what I'm going to say without you stopping me. The sentence hurt more than I expected. Not because I intended to stop her. Because somewhere inside her, the possibility still existed that I might. I wiped my hands on a towel. Then I nodded. No argument, no demand to preview the speech, no reminder that I had raised her, no kidney, no 15 years. She had invited Meredith. Meredith would sit there, and whatever Celia chose to say would belong to Celia. That night, after everyone went to bed, I stood alone in the living room beside the piano. The lid was closed. For once, no sheet music waited on the stand. I rested my hand against the polished wood. For 15 years, I believed love meant keeping Celia from being taken from me. The concert was going to ask whether I had learned anything at all. In 5 days, I would sit in the same room as the sister who had accused me of kidnapping her daughter. And for the first time since Meredith returned, I had no idea which one of us Celia intended to disappoint. The 5 days before the concert felt like several clocks, running in the same house. Celia's belonged to rehearsals, production calls, program notes, and the ordinary work of preparing a solo recital people had bought tickets for long before our family became news. The legal clock moved without rhythm. 3 mornings before the concert, my lawyer told me the false report matter had been referred to the state's attorney for review. It was not a charge and not a verdict. Prosecutors would decide what to do with the investigation already assembled. I told Celia, and she folded her rehearsal schedule into her bag without treating the news like a victory. Neither of us wanted her concert to become a celebration of Meredith's trouble. The next day, Meredith's nonprofit drew a line of its own. Its review had found that her personal separation story had grown stronger across public materials, and the board extended her leave, suspended her public representation of the organization, and sought a correction of the kidnapping claim. Meredith refused. A short public statement followed, distancing the nonprofit from her allegation. Nobody needed to call her a fraud. An organization built on advocacy had simply stopped lending institutional credibility to a claim it could no longer stand behind. 2 nights before the concert, Graham moved out temporarily. Paul learned first. Then Graham spoke with both of us. He did not ask me to judge Meredith or predict their marriage. He said he could have survived learning that his wife had once done something terrible and regretted it. What he did not know how to live with was a history whose facts changed whenever he tried to hold them still. Separation was not a dramatic team switch. It was the consequence of no longer being willing to pretend the contradictions did not matter. Tessa handled the fracture differently. She kept talking to Celia directly. The day before the concert, Celia told me Meredith had described the invitation as a family reconciliation, although Celia had promised no such thing. Meredith wanted Tessa beside her in VIP. Tessa said she already had separate instructions from Celia. Graham handled the practical side because Tessa was still 13. He drove her, confirmed the guest arrangement with production, authorized the backstage access Celia requested, and knew only that staff would escort her safely. He did not know Celia's speech, neither did Tessa, neither did I. Celia alone knew what she intended to do, and I tried not to ask. That became harder as the concert approached. The night before, I stood in our bedroom deciding between two dresses. I realized I had changed my mind 4 times without noticing. Paul sat on the edge of the bed tying his shoes. He watched me put one dress back and take out the first again. I finally admitted what I had been avoiding. I was afraid Celia would call Meredith Mom in front of everyone. The sentence sounded embarrassingly small after police reports and felony reviews. Paul did not laugh. I told him I knew Celia had the right. I knew biological connection did not disappear because Meredith failed her. I knew meeting Tessa and hearing about Meredith's regret had complicated the past. I knew Celia could choose some relationship with Meredith without reducing what we had. Knowing all of that did not make the image hurt less. I had been 24 when I signed forms for school, 25 when I learned which medication side effects frightened Celia most, 27 when I taught her how to make grilled cheese without burning the pan, 30 when I sat through a piano competition in an auditorium so cold I wore my coat indoors. I had stood beside every ordinary version of her. The possibility that Meredith might receive one word I had secretly wanted for years exposed a selfishness I would rather not have seen. Paul did not promise Celia would never do it. He reminded me that if my love required Celia to reject another relationship in order to prove mine mattered, then I had misunderstood the lesson I claimed to have learned. I looked at the dress in my hand. There was nothing comforting about the truth. That was why it helped. I chose the first dress. Then I stopped rehearsing imaginary responses. If Celia called Meredith Mom, I would stay in my seat. If Celia criticized me, I would stay in my seat. If she told the audience that hiding Meredith's return had hurt her, I would stay in my seat. I was not bringing documents. I was not bringing a rebuttal. I was going as the woman who had raised her. And for once, that role required me not to control the outcome. Meredith's response to the invitation arrived indirectly. Celia showed me one message. I knew you'd understand when you were ready. She did not correct Meredith's interpretation. I asked why. She said the invitation meant only what it said. Come to the concert. Listen. She was done explaining herself in advance. She refused to explain herself so others could prepare the version of her response they preferred. That answer made me uncomfortable. It was supposed to. On the afternoon of the concert, our house moved with an odd combination of normal routine and ceremonial care. Paul ironed his shirt. Mara spent too long deciding whether her shoes looked childish. I attempted to eat something and failed after 3 bites. Celia had left earlier for soundcheck and final rehearsal. Her absence made the house feel like we were preparing for an event centered on someone who had already moved beyond us. Maybe that was appropriate. By early evening, Chicago had turned sharply cold. The sidewalks outside the venue shone under streetlights from a brief drizzle. People arrived in coats, their breath faint in the October air. Cars stopped beneath the entrance awning and pulled away again. The recital hall was large enough to feel important without becoming an arena. That mattered. Celia had wanted the concert to remain music, not spectacle. Inside, the lobby was brighter than I expected. Programs were stacked beneath a framed photograph of Celia at the piano. Her biography mentioned the regional orchestras, scholarships, conservatory mentors, and upcoming performances. It did not mention Meredith. It did not mention me. It did not mention the kidney. I read the paragraph twice. Something about that omission made my throat tighten. For once, her biography was about the work. Press had been restricted to agreed areas. Venue staff knew there were security concerns because of the publicity, but there was no sense of a siege. Most people around us were there because they wanted to hear Celia play. That helped. Then I saw Meredith. She was already seated in the VIP section. For one disorienting second, the sight of her under concert hall lights pulled the television studio back into my head. She wore a dark dress and sat upright. Her hands were folded over a small evening bag. Nobody was beside her. Graham was not there. Neither was Tessa. Meredith looked toward the stage often. I could not know what she was thinking, but I had seen the message she sent Celia. I had seen how she interpreted the invitation, and I could see relief in the way she carried herself, a softness that had been absent in every clip from the previous weeks. She looked like someone expecting something to be restored. That made me nervous. Paul noticed where my attention had gone and touched 2 fingers lightly against the back of my hand. No speech, just contact. We took our seats. Mara sat on my other side. The program said the performance would run just under 2 hours. It included an intermission and a possible encore. Possible. I knew from Celia that the encore had become important to her. I still did not know why. 5 minutes before the lights were due to dim, I checked the VIP row again. Meredith remained alone. I looked behind us. No Graham, no Tessa. I knew Graham had driven Tessa to the venue. Celia had told me that much. What I did not know was where she had gone after arriving. My mind started moving too quickly. I leaned toward Paul and asked whether he had seen her. He had not. Mara followed my gaze toward the VIP section. She noticed Meredith immediately. Then she noticed the empty seat beside her. A stage manager I recognized from one of Celia's earlier production calls came down the aisle. She stopped near our row. She bent close enough that her voice would not carry. Celia had asked her to confirm that a pre-cleared minor guest had arrived safely and had been taken through the backstage entrance by staff. That was all she said. She did not name Tessa. She did not need to. The last piece clicked into place without explaining what it meant. Tessa was backstage. With Celia, Meredith did not appear to know. Neither did most of the room. My pulse thudded high in my throat. Mara leaned toward Paul as the house lights gave their first warning flicker. Her whisper was barely audible. She said that if the evening somehow turned into another family meeting, she had already checked, and the backstage exit was closer than the main doors. Paul glanced toward her. I'm proud at least one of us has an evacuation plan. Mara covered a smile with the edge of her program. I did too. For 2 seconds, tension loosened its grip. Then the lights dimmed. Conversation across the hall faded into a rustle of programs and shifting coats. On stage, the piano waited beneath a single pool of light. I looked once more toward Meredith. She lifted her chin toward the stage, with the expression of a woman expecting an answer she believed she already understood. Then I looked toward the dark opening beyond the curtains. Celia was somewhere behind them. So was Tessa. And as the auditorium went completely quiet, one question crowded out everything else in my mind. Where was Tessa, and what had Celia brought her backstage to do? When Celia walked onto the stage, the first thing I noticed was that she did not look toward either of us. Not toward Meredith in the VIP section. Not toward me. She crossed the stage beneath the warm white lights, sat at the piano, adjusted the bench by less than an inch, and placed her hands above the keys. Then she played. For the first few minutes, I forgot Tessa was backstage. I forgot the state's attorney was reviewing Meredith's police report. I forgot the television interviews, the lawyers, the archived speeches. I forgot the word kidnapped that had followed our family through October like a stain no amount of explanation could wash away. Music had always been one of the few places where Celia could make a room obey the same rules she did. A note sounded because she touched the key. Silence followed because she lifted her hand. Nothing hid behind interpretation. I watched her shoulders settle as the first piece opened. The tension I had seen during the previous weeks was still there if you knew her well enough to find it. It no longer controlled the performance. She was not forcing the music forward. She was listening to it again. That mattered. A quiet phrase in the second piece pulled an old image across my mind before I could stop it. Celia small enough that her feet did not properly reach the floor, striking the same middle C over and over because she had discovered my patience had limits and found that hilarious. I did not stay in the memory. The woman on stage was 20. That was the whole point. She had survived long enough to become someone I could not reduce to the child I remembered. Beside me, Paul listened without moving, except to turn the program once between pieces. Mara sat on my other side, her earlier joke about evacuation routes forgotten. Across the hall, Meredith remained upright in her seat. She applauded when everyone else did. She did not look at me. I tried not to look at her. The harder task was admitting what I was actually waiting for. Not the encore. Not even Tessa. A verdict. Somewhere during the third piece, that realization became impossible to avoid. I had spent the past several weeks telling myself Celia did not need to choose between us. I had said it aloud. I had practiced believing it. I had refused to publish her medical history as evidence. I had stopped myself from interfering when she met Meredith. And still, sitting in that concert hall, part of me was waiting to hear whether 15 years of love had earned me a title. That shame settled more heavily than fear. Meredith had tried to own Celia's past by rewriting it. I had never done that, but I could still turn love into a test. I could ask Celia to prove, publicly, that I mattered more. The realization did not make me noble. It made me stop watching Meredith. I watched Celia instead. By the final piece, the auditorium felt smaller than it had at the beginning. The world beyond the stage disappeared behind darkness. Celia's hands moved through the closing passage with the precision I had seen thousands of times. They moved with a freedom I had seen much less often. The final chord faded. For a second, nobody moved. Then applause rose around us. It was ordinary concert applause, warm, sustained, appropriate to the performance. People stood in some sections. Others remained seated while clapping. I did not count who stood. I did not care. Celia returned for a bow. Then, instead of sitting immediately for the encore, she walked toward the microphone. Production had placed it near the piano before the concert began. The applause faded. My body knew before my mind did. This was it. Celia waited until the room settled. She looked across the audience. Then she looked directly at me. This woman isn't my mother. Everything inside me stopped because she was looking at me, not Meredith. Mara shifted beside me. Paul's hand moved near mine without closing around it. Celia continued before the room could decide what her first sentence meant. She called me what I actually was. Her aunt, her donor, her former guardian, the person who had packed terrible lunches, signed school forms, sat through lessons, and stayed when staying became ordinary. She is my aunt. She is my donor. She was my guardian. She is the person who stayed. None of that becomes smaller because I call it what it is. My eyes burned. I had been waiting for a verdict without admitting it, and Celia refused to give me one. She did not need to make me her mother in order to honor what we were. Then she turned toward Meredith. She acknowledged Meredith as the woman who gave birth to her, and said she had recently learned that Meredith had returned once after leaving a fact I had been wrong to keep from her when she grew older. The admission stung, but Celia did not linger over it. She moved to the boundary that mattered. Meredith had left during the worst medical crisis of her childhood, later returned once, and met a family that resisted sudden access. Those facts could coexist. What Meredith could not do was turn leaving into being robbed or boundaries into kidnapping. The legal accusation would be handled somewhere other than Celia's stage. For a moment, I thought she was finished. Then she looked toward the side curtain and said another person had been forced to live inside this story without being asked what she wanted from it. Footsteps crossed the backstage floor. A staff member opened the curtain, and Tessa walked out looking exactly what she was. A nervous 13-year-old. Not a witness, and not evidence. She stopped beside Celia and took her hand. "This is my sister." Tessa did not accuse Meredith and never touched the microphone. She did not need to. Celia said only that the two of them were getting to know each other and would decide for themselves what that relationship became. Standing there together, they no longer needed anyone to translate one sister to the other. I looked at Meredith and saw her hands go still. Whatever else she still controlled, she was no longer the only bridge between her daughters. Celia returned to the microphone once more. She said she had spent years being reduced to labels survivor, transplant pianist, prodigy, and now kidnapped pianist. She was not a prize proving which woman had loved her better, and she was not a repayment for the kidney that saved her life. What happened at 5 belonged to her history. It did not get to own everything after. The investigation could handle the accusation. She would handle her life. Then Celia said she wanted to finish the evening with the one thing she had come there to do: play. A staff member met her at the edge of the stage and guided her backstage again. That small logistical detail steadied me. She was still 13. Someone was responsible for getting her safely back to Graham. The world had not become a symbolic drama just because an audience was watching. Celia returned to the piano. There was applause as she sat. Some people stood, others remained in their seats. The hall settled again before Celia placed her hands on the keys. Celia placed her hands on the keys. Then she played the encore she had chosen for herself. I had expected something triumphant. It was not. The piece was gentle, open, less technically aggressive than much of the program. There were stretches where the music seemed to leave more air between notes than sound. I watched her hands and remembered what Inez had told her about playing before music became proof of anything. For the first time in weeks, I was not listening for what the performance said about our family. I was only listening because Celia wanted to play it. That difference reached me slowly. A saved child did not owe me an extraordinary adulthood. A raised child did not owe me a public title. A loved person did not owe me predictability. The hardest part of loving Celia might not have been staying when Meredith left. It might be refusing to make my staying into a claim on who Celia became afterward. When the final note faded, Celia lowered her hands. The applause came again. I stood this time because I had just heard a beautiful performance. Nothing more complicated than that. Meredith remained in the room long enough for the lights to rise. I did not approach her. She did not approach me. People began collecting coats and programs around us. Ushers opened the doors. The audience spilled into the lobby, carrying dozens of interpretations of what they had just heard, none of which we could control. Paul touched my shoulder. Mara looked toward the aisle where Meredith had been sitting. Her seat was empty. I felt no urge to follow. Backstage afterward, the atmosphere was strangely normal. Music staff carried equipment. Someone asked where Celia wanted flowers placed. A production assistant checked that Tessa had already been reunited with Graham through the agreed exit. Celia came toward us still in her concert clothes. I did not ask whether the speech had been aimed at me. I knew enough now not to ask questions whose only purpose was reassurance. I hugged her. She hugged me back. That was sufficient. The next morning, I woke later than usual. For a few seconds, I did not remember the concert. Then I saw the program folded on my dresser. Downstairs, Paul had already made coffee. Mara was eating toast and watching clips of the performance with the sound off. She said hearing the same applause from phone speakers ruined everything. Celia was still asleep. My phone rang at 8:17. It was my lawyer. There was no dramatic preamble. The state's attorney's office had completed the review that had been underway before the concert. They had approved a charge arising from Meredith's knowingly false police report. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. Paul saw my face and turned off the coffee grinder. The timing had nothing to do with Celia's speech. No prosecutor had watched the concert and decided Meredith deserved punishment. The evidence had already been under review. The authority Meredith signed, the guardianship process, her knowledge of where Celia lived, her return to the family home, the contradictions between those facts, and the report she later gave police. The concert had resolved something emotional. The law had followed its own clock. And on that morning, the two timelines finally met. Meredith had spent 15 years recasting I Left as they took her. Then, she had placed that rewritten story inside a police report. Now, for the first time, she was going to have to answer for the part of the story that was not interpretation at all. The charge did not end anything quickly. For weeks, our family had lived at the speed of headlines and phone calls, but the criminal case moved on a different clock. Documents were reviewed, attorneys spoke, dates came and went, and winter settled over Chicago, while the concert slowly became something that had happened rather than something we were still inside. Months after the charge was filed, my lawyer called me at the library. I had spent the morning helping an older man enlarge the text on his e-reader and showing a mother where the children's audiobooks had been moved. Against that ordinary background, he told me Meredith had agreed to plead guilty to one Class 4 felony count of disorderly conduct based on knowingly making the false crime report. The contradictions investigators had spent months verifying were no longer being treated as a family disagreement. She could explain away. She chose a plea rather than a trial. The sentencing came later. I attended because the case had begun with my name attached to the word kidnapping. I needed to see where the formal record ended. Celia came too. Paul stayed with Mara. The courtroom was fluorescent and ordinary, full of people waiting for matters that meant everything to them. Meredith stood beside her attorney without the frame a television camera had once given her. The judge imposed 24 months of probation, 100 hours of community service, and the applicable financial penalties and court costs. There was no incarceration and no speech about motherhood. The consequence was the felony itself, and the sentence attached to the report she had chosen to make. When Celia and I left the courthouse, cold air moved between the buildings and salt marked the sidewalk white. I had imagined justice would feel warm. Instead, it felt like weight being removed. The absence of something I had carried so long I had forgotten how heavy it was. The criminal case was only one track. My defamation claim addressed the public kidnapping accusation, and after the guilty plea, the lawyers reached a settlement covering documented losses and legal costs. Meredith also had to issue a clear public correction, acknowledging that I had not kidnapped Celia. I read it once on the same kind of screen where I had first watched her accuse me, then put the phone down. I did not post a victory message. The correction mattered because it repaired the public record, not because it gave me another weapon. Her professional consequence followed. The nonprofit terminated her as director of family advocacy and reviewed materials that had relied on her separation story. It did not erase every family she had helped. Useful work and private dishonesty could exist in the same life. But credibility was part of the job Meredith had built, and the guilty plea meant colleagues no longer had to accept her personal history on trust. The question she had avoided for years would now follow the story wherever it appeared. What actually happened? Graham remained separated from her. He did not rush into divorce. I respected that. Their marriage was not my reward. He had a daughter to consider and years of his own history to examine. Whether he eventually stayed with Meredith or left permanently would depend on things I could not decide for him. What changed was simpler. He stopped accepting explanations without dates. When Meredith said the family had forced her away, he asked what she had done next. When she described being blocked, he asked whether there had been a legal order. When emotion replaced fact, he noticed. That may not sound like a dramatic collapse of control. It was. The same thing happened with Tessa. She did not become part of our household. She did not call me Aunt Joanna and declare Meredith dead to her. Nothing so convenient happened. She loved her mother. She was also angry with her. Both were allowed to be true. Her relationship with Celia continued independently. Sometimes they went weeks without seeing each other because Celia traveled or Tessa had school. Sometimes they exchanged ridiculous messages late in the evening. Once Tessa came to one of Celia's smaller performances and complained afterward that everyone in classical music seemed to know when to clap except her. Celia told her almost nobody really knew. Most people watched the confident person nearest them. Tessa found that reassuring. Their relationship had no grand mission. That was why I trusted it. They were not trying to repair Meredith. They were becoming sisters in whatever form made sense to them, without an interpreter. Several weeks after sentencing, Celia told me she planned to meet Meredith. I did not ask to go. That was progress. They chose a quiet public place. The boundaries were simple. Celia would leave whenever she wanted. They were not discussing the criminal case as a negotiation. Celia was not there to forgive Meredith, because a judge had imposed a sentence. When she came home afterward, I did not question her at the door. She found me later in the kitchen. What I know about the meeting comes from what she decided to tell me. Meredith began with context. The hospital, fear, grief, my father, the way our family took over when she was collapsing. Celia let her speak, then asked her to stop describing everyone else's choices and name her own first one. According to Celia, Meredith went quiet. For 15 years, she had wrapped that moment in other language. Overwhelmed, pushed out, unable to get back in. This time, Celia waited until the explanations ran out. I left. Celia did not hug her or promise forgiveness. She told Meredith that if they ever had a relationship, it would have to begin with that sentence, rather than they took you or I lost you. Meredith's admission did not erase the report, or the years Graham and Tessa had lived inside her edited history. It was simply the first step that did not require someone else to carry her responsibility. Celia promised nothing beyond the possibility of truth. My repair work with Mara was quieter. I put her school events on the calendar and stopped treating them as movable simply because nothing terrible would happen if I missed one. When fine came too quickly, I sometimes asked again, then respected the answer instead of turning attention into surveillance. I overcorrected for a while. One evening, Mara informed me that being seen was good, but being monitored like a suspicious package was not. Paul laughed harder than he should have, and I adjusted. Repair turned out to be less like one grand apology than 100 small choices made on ordinary days. Celia made corrections of her own. She reduced several public commitments because she finally admitted she did not want all of them. She kept performances that excited her, chose repertoire with Inez out of curiosity as well as ambition, and declined interviews interested in the transplant story more than the music. Piano remained hers. A missed practice, a bad rehearsal, or a good concert no longer had to prove that the life I helped save had been worth saving. Spring arrived slowly. The city softened. Snow along parking lots collapsed into dirty piles before disappearing altogether. The days stretched later. At the library, children came in carrying jackets instead of wearing them. One Sunday, we went out to dinner. Nothing had happened. That is important. No anniversary, no court update, no performance. No reason to gather, except that everyone was available at the same time, which had become rare enough to feel like an event. Paul drove. Mara complained about his parking. Celia spent half the ride showing Tessa something on her phone, before remembering Tessa was not actually in the car and sending it to her instead. At the restaurant, we argued gently about appetizers. The waiter arrived to take our order. Before any of us chose an entree, Celia ordered dessert. I looked at her, not disapproving, just surprised. For years, this was the girl who planned practice schedules around dinner reservations, who measured time in productive units, who could turn relaxation into one more task to perform correctly. She caught my expression. Then she shrugged. What? I'm being ordinary. Mara laughed first. Paul followed. I did too. The waiter had no idea why 4 people found the sentence so funny. That made it better. Celia ate dessert before dinner, stole a bite from Mara's plate, and got her wrist slapped for it. The moment was small enough that no one outside our table would have understood why it mattered. To me, it was peace without performance. For years I had thought giving Celia a kidney was the hardest way I would ever have to love her. Surgery had rules, tests, consent, recovery a before and an after. Love was harder because nobody could tell me exactly when care became control. I had stayed when Meredith left, and I had raised Celia. Both facts mattered. Neither gave me ownership of what came next. I did not know how far Celia would take the piano, what relationship she might someday have with Meredith, or what Tessa would mean to her 10 years from now. For the first time, I did not need those answers. I had helped save her life. The rest of it belonged to her. The next chapter was Celia's to write, and that was exactly how it should be.